Next Chapter Podcasts.
The world is growing more complicated by the day, but too often, everyone seems to be operating on the same old assumptions about global affairs. But if you're not sure that world domination by the United States is the right path for America or the world, or if you've got questions about conventional geopolitical thinking, you should check out American Prestige, a foreign policy podcast from a different perspective. Every week on American Prestige, historian and former Bernie Sanders foreign policy advisor Daniel Bessner, that's me, and my co-host, the journalist Derek Davison, analyze U.S. foreign policy from a critical framework that sheds light on myriad topics related to international affairs. So, if you're curious to know what U.S. foreign policy would look like if the interests of all people in the world, and not only rich Americans, were taken into account, then check out American Prestige at AmericanPrestigePod.com. That's AmericanPrestigePod.com. And you could, of course, also find us on your favorite podcast app.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
The South is where the environmental justice movement was birthed. The South is where we see a lot of these really kind of different types of environmental issues beyond polluting facilities. We see so many different types of issues that communities are facing.
Look at something like Jackson, Mississippi, where I think they are having some of the most exciting, meaningful conversation about things like climate change in Jackson, Mississippi, and who should be at the table of that conversation.
There's sometimes this narrative of humanity as a virus or a disease, and that is not true. We are of the earth, and not only are we capable of just not doing harm, we can actually do good. We can actually be a part of making a more productive, a more beautiful, more delicious ecosystem.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this the South got something to say.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our New South, a podcast series presented by the Levine Museum of New South in Charlotte, North Carolina, with the generous support from the Knight Foundation. Hi, my name is Dr. Robert Green II, coming to you from Clafton University, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kevin Blackistone, coming to you from College Park, Maryland. And we truly thank you for tuning in today. Over the course of this series, we'll be discussing the concept of the New South and how it's evolved with academics, activists, and creatives.
We'll investigate the South, asking questions of our expert guests in key areas like socioeconomic mobility, voting rights, and discriminatory practices that have shaped the South over the decades leading up to today's challenges.
We thank you for joining us on this journey and ask that you please tell your friends and family about us. Follow the show, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. Okay, let's get to today's episode of the show.
South got something to say.
Today's episode of Our New South focuses on environmental justice and some of the most critical issues affecting the public health and safety of residents in the South today. We will discuss how groups like Earth Justice are leading the fight for environmental justice in the South, and how Native tribes like the Catawba in South Carolina are being affected by government policies that threaten the health of their tribe and their native lands. Before we get to our guests, I would like to ask Dr. Robert Green to provide us with some brief insight on environmental justice in the South. And Robert, I know that you labored over the title of this particular episode, Behold the Land, and you pointed out that it resonated with you because of something you read that W.B. Du Bois wrote back in 1946. And the line was, "Behold the land, the rich and resourceful land from which for 100 years its best elements have been running away, its youth and hope, black and white, scurrying north because they are of each other." What was it about that phrase that you thought made a perfect title for this particular episode?
Well, when we consider the history of environmental justice and its origins in North Carolina and the rural South, I kept thinking back to all the battles for justice in every single form it takes throughout Southern history. And when Du Bois wrote this speech and gave this speech in Columbia, South Carolina in 1946, one of the things he was trying to get across to his audience, men and women of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, was that to make a better tomorrow for everyone, the fight had to begin in the South. The South couldn't be left behind. The same was true in 1946, and the same was true in 1982 with the beginning of the environmental social justice movement in Warren County, North Carolina. I always think about Du Bois and how Du Bois still has a lot to say to us even now. But in this case, he's quite literally saying, look at the landscape, the land on which we all live as Southerners. Embrace it, enjoy it, and protect it.
Absolutely prescient.
About every summer, we meet for a trip.
Vacation has officially begun on Netflix.
To best enjoy your trip, we suggest the following itinerary.
I say we just wing it.
Wing it.
See where the wind takes us.
From best-selling author Emily Henry.
Are you guys like a thing? Oh, no, we're just friends. Platonic, travel companions.
Comes your next favorite rom-com.
Who wants to go skinny dipping? Alex does.
Vacation Alex!
I love it when you get weird.
People We Meet on Vacation. Now playing on Netflix. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
The summer of 1982 witnessed a watershed moment in the history of environmental activism in the United States. For 6 weeks, residents in Warren County, North Carolina, in a mostly Black area of that county, staged protests against the creation of a landfill everyone agreed would contaminate nearby soil. While Black Americans and other minority groups in the South had, on local levels, often noted the discriminatory practice of dumping toxic waste in nearby areas, the 1982 protests in Warren County was the impetus for a new way of thinking about environmentalism through the lens of environmental justice. Involvement by North Carolina-based activists such as Benjamin Chavis, a future executive director of the NAACP, made the Warren County crisis national news. The idea of environmental justice recognizes that while every human being has a vested interest in clean air, water, and soil, some human beings are more impacted than others by pollution, toxic waste dumping, and other conditions that do harm to the natural world. In the American South, such impact has disproportionately impacted Black Americans, poor white Southerners, and indigenous peoples alike. For example, in 1983, the radical magazine Southern Exposure ran a feature story about residents in Bell County, Kentucky, who fought back against the polluting of Yellow Creek, a prominent stream in Bell County. Due to the Middlesboro Tanning Company's production of waste that flowed into the stream, generations of residents complained of the stream being nothing more than, quote, black ooze, end quote. All across the South, individuals, organizations, and communities are fighting against environmental degradation and for a cleaner, healthier New South. The Catawba tribe, the only federally recognized tribe in South Carolina, is currently leading efforts to clean up and purify the land on the border of North and South Carolina. Groups such as Earth Justice, a national organization dedicated to using the law to fight for environmental justice, has been active in the South in pushing for greater environmental justice and freedom. Older organizations have also begun to accept the challenge of fighting for a cleaner tomorrow. The NAACP's website entry on environmental and climate justice states that, quote, Environmental injustice, including the proliferation of climate change, systematically impacts communities of color and low-income communities in the U.S. and around the world, end quote. Academics such as Robert D. Bullard, who studies the idea of environmental racism to explain the disproportionate impact on Black Americans, and Carolyn Finney, among others, have delved deeply into the relationship between people of color and the land in the South. And with the specter of climate change becoming a major global political issue, the crisis of environmental racism and the hope of environmental justice will shape the South for generations to come.
Our first guest today is Dominique Burkhart, a senior attorney for Earth Justice, a global nonprofit organization created to protect people's health, preserve wildlife, advance clean energy, and to combat climate change. Dominique, who is based in Miami, immigrated from Jamaica, but has lived in Florida since childhood. Our New South welcomes Dominique Burkhart. Dominique, thank you so much for doing this. Please introduce yourself to our audience, where you're originally from, where you're at now, and what it is you do.
Sure. It's nice to see you. Nice to meet you, Kevin, and Mr. Blackstone, Mr. Green. My name is Dominique Burkhart. I'm a senior attorney with Earth Justice. I work out of the Florida regional office based out of Miami. And I work primarily on issues of environmental justice. And so it's really an exciting intersectional type of field. I'm happy to be on your show to talk about that today. I'm originally from Jamaica. I was born there. I lived there until I was 10, then moved to Florida. And I feel like a Florida girl. Grew up in Orlando, went to the University of Florida in Gainesville, and now I'm in South Florida. I feel like I know this. Go Gators, exactly. It was the Tim Tebow days, actually, when I was an undergrad.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
and Joakim knows. Good times. And so I feel like I know Florida, inside and out, and, just happy to be here to talk about issues, not just in the state that I live in, but also I think the Southeast region that from what I know and can speak to.
And if I'm not mistaken, you were originally a public defender when you got out of law school.
Yes.
How does one get from being a public defender to working on environmental justice, and what's the connection, if there is one, between the two?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I applied to Earth Justice, I was kind of like, well, I don't have a traditional environmental law background, but I have experience advocating for people who are, I would say victims of systemic oppression, being a voice for people who don't have a voice in a system. I think seeing the criminal justice system up close, I was at a place, I think an inflection point in my career where I was just seeing a lot of connections between things. It was kind of like, during the Trump era, seeing the immigration policies, seeing criminal justice issues, and then connecting that with environmental justice. I had taken a class in law school, so I was familiar with a lot of the issues, and just seeing these threads and being able to see how a lot of these forces connect, and a lot of the people who are struggling with economic injustice or criminal justice issues and things like that, they might also be the people who are dealing with environmental injustices. And it's kind of the same societal forces. And I think I was able to see those connections clearly and draw those connections and transition that into continuing to do public interest work, but just in a different, I would say, area of law, different issues.
Thank you.
And Dominique, again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Robert Green II, coming to you from Columbia, South Carolina. And as someone who has a doctorate in history from the University of South Carolina, and as someone who's a Georgia native, I will excuse the Go Gators talk earlier in this podcast. But no, we're grateful to have you on, because environmental justice is such an important issue in the South these days, and Italy, across the country and around the world. I know that recently your work in Miami has really brought to your attention the concerns over waste and how to really control waste in major cities. But what are some of the issues you're seeing in the South specifically as they relate to environmental justice?
Sure. And I'm happy to be able to speak about this, because I think, when we think about environmental issues in the South, we tend to think about natural disasters, and that's very important. Or we tend to think about coastal issues, sea level rise, and things like that. And that's all very important and very deserving of time and resources and attention. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is that there are a lot of very deep-rooted environmental justice issues in the South, in Florida, and throughout the Southeast that we might not tend to associate with the South when we think of it. And so there's a very big one that we see that these are the waste issues that I work on are these polluting facilities that are overwhelmingly in Black and Brown communities. So in working on a waste incinerator issue in Miami, this was an incinerator that it was a very old facility. It actually burned down earlier this year. It was around from the 80s, very old technology. It was basically plaguing a Latinx community in Miami-Dade County, just the quality of life issues. People couldn't go outside. People were talking about, I didn't have asthma before I moved here, and now I have asthma, or my kids have these issues, skin rashes. I can't breathe when I go outside. Someone told me something that just always stuck with me, that, there were kids at a park nearby. This it's a waste incinerator, so that means it burns trash. It's a trash burning facility. And it's in the middle of residential communities. There's parks, there's schools nearby. There were kids outside at soccer practice, and the parents had to run outside waving their arms to shut down the practice so they could take their kids home. That's how bad the stench was. That's how bad this was, just beyond a nuisance for these people who lived here. And so in working on this, we had opposed a permit renewal at Earth Justice, and we were looking at issues that the county was looking at renewing for another 20 years out. The contract with the company that operated this, the company is called Covanta. They operate incinerators. There have been a lot of problems around their facilities. And other advocate groups, like for instance, in New Jersey, have been opposed to their facilities. And in doing so, we zoomed out because we were realizing what's interesting is that in this permit renewal process, that this community, a lot of the people didn't speak English. And so they didn't know what our state environmental protection agency was doing with renewing this. They didn't know how to have a say. Our state DEP, that's our Department of Environmental Protection, didn't want to provide interpreters initially at a public meeting around this. And so from that, we ended up filing a broader civil rights complaint. And what we saw was that in Florida, one is that we have the most waste incinerators of any state in the United States, aside from New York. So this is just a deep entrenched policy choice that is harming communities. We saw that the majority, 70% of these, were in Black and Brown communities. So that was in South Florida, that was in Tampa, that was in rural parts of the state. That's what we were seeing, is that these were the groups being affected. And then nationally, 80% of these facilities are in Black and Brown communities. And so we realized that this is a polluting facility. So it's an environmental justice issue, but it's a waste issue. When you look at where are these waste sites going, they're overwhelmingly in Black and Brown communities. And that's not just in Florida, that's throughout the United States. There's other issues I've worked on, migrant detention issues. There's the Homestead detention camp, very controversial, eventually shut down, although we don't know if it could be reopened at any point. And migrant children, these were children who were separated from their parent or their families at the border, or they came here unaccompanied. They're adjacent to, it's like across the street from a military Superfund site. So that means this is historically contaminated property. And what we're doing is, and I say we as a society, is building these detention camps, and we're putting children there. And so they're being exposed to, environmental contamination, the soil and potentially in the water. There's noise pollution because it's near an Air Force base. So there's these jets coming and going. And you think about, these are children, they're still developing, and they're being detained and essentially incarcerated and being held at a site like this. So there's lots of issues, that's just in Miami and Florida. Our organization, Earth Justice, has been involved with, there's wastewater and sanitation issues in Alabama. The Department of Justice had to get involved because people are dealing with just open, raw sewage on their property. These are Black communities. No one should ever have to deal with a health threat and deal with just the indignity of that, where there's just this improper infrastructure. And it's overwhelmingly, it's Black and brown communities who are impacted by this. It's just, that's what we're seeing. So there's lots of issues. Those are just a handful of things that we've worked on at Earth Justice.
And as a very quick follow-up, you've mentioned several times in your answer how this is disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities. In particular, I wasn't even aware of the problem over detention camps being next to some of these really sick and nasty sites. Why is that the case? Why do we see this across the country, that it's Black and brown communities in particular being affected? I think our audience probably has a vague idea, but could you make it plain for us, so to speak?
Sure. I mean, it's, again, just kind of going back to the initial question. I think some of these forces of systemic racism, I think that were more explicit at an earlier time in our country's history, and not far away in our country's history. I think in probably recent history, in the past century or so, I think it's the legacy of that. So, for example, with the waste sites, we were looking at redlining in Miami and in Tampa, where there are these problematic incinerators. And that's where the government is saying, these neighborhoods, we're not going to give loans and approve loans for housing here. We're going to rate these as D ratings. We're going to give these, we're basically going to say these are undesirable neighborhoods. That's where we saw there's Black populations and Latino populations that live there. So these were targeted communities to say these are undesirable. And then that's when you see these industrial zoning kind of encroaching in. That's where it's not even just encroaching, I would say targeted for these, for waste facilities, for polluting facilities. That's where they ended up being cited, ended up being developed. And then when you have this reinforcing, well, that's how that area is zoned, that just gets reinforced decade after decade. I think it comes down to, as well, political will and political power.
When we started working on this podcast, one of the first people we interviewed was Tressie Cottom. I don't know if you know her, a scholar, and she writes for the New York Times. And one of the things that she said about the South and its problems and struggles is that everything that the South kind of has to work on to be better really benefits the rest of the country. Like it's almost as if the South is a step ahead of everybody else in dealing with these different sorts of things. And before talking to you, I just happened to read up on environmental justice movements in the country. And one of the studies that you're probably familiar with happened to illustrate what you just pointed out about the problems with incinerators and waste and so forth, concentrated in the South. And it also pointed out that in 1982, that was really when the environmental justice movement kind of started in the state of North Carolina with a protest.
Yes.
So as you work in this space and you make these connections, what can be done in the South to make it safer for everyone, particularly the people who are suffering from it the most, and maybe expand to the rest of the country, be part of the vanguard in the environmental justice movement?
I think, that's such a good question. There's probably a lot of things that could be done and that we would want to see done. I think one key thing to keep in mind is that when we think about decisions around how are we going to manage our waste, where are we going to put a facility, do we even need that facility? I think it's really important to keep in mind that these are political and policy decisions. I think it's really easy for decision makers to say, well, we have no choice. We see this in the waste space where it's, this incinerator in Miami, the Doral community burned down. And the county's saying, well, we have to build a new one immediately. They're trying to build a new one right now as we speak. And there's this urgency and we have to go. We need a new one because the only ways we can manage our waste are either to build and expand landfills or to have incinerators. When in reality, there's a whole suite of ways you can manage waste. We've looked at, we've studied and researched at Earth Justice zero waste options, where you're diverting waste from that traditional waste stream into landfills and incinerators, or you're basically burying it in the ground or burning it. There's recycling policies, there's composting, there's ways that you can incentivize a more circular economy, reusing materials. You can put more pressure on producers to think about, how are we packaging things? How are we putting these materials into the commerce stream, basically? And I think it's easy with the pressure of industry for policymakers to think, well, these are our only options. This is the only way we've done things. We can never envision doing anything different. And then it becomes this kind of reinforcing type of thing. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that our decision makers are choosing one set of policies that are impacting certain communities, and they can also make a choice to do something different and to really put their resources towards something different. And just a quick follow-up on that is a new incinerator is going to cost $1.5 billion for Miami-Dade County. That is a ton of money. The county doesn't even have that money right now. They would have to raise that. They might need private sponsorship for that, increased taxes for that. That is a lot of money being poured into one industry that they'd be locked into that contract for decades to come. And that is taking away resources to build out other forms of waste management.
No, and to that point, I really want to bring to attention to our audience a quote, something that you wrote about what Miami-Dade County could be doing instead. You once wrote that, quote, Miami-Dade has a historic opportunity to be a leader in our state in reducing harmful emissions, improving public health, and strengthening racial equity through the county's Zero Waste Action Plan. Could you talk a bit more about that quote and what you're hoping Miami-Dade County could do if pushed in the right direction?
Right. So that's definitely ties in with the idea of transforming how we manage waste and making new policy decisions and not doubling down on what they've always done. I think what we're trying to see, and the reason we point to Miami-Dade as this leader in doing this, is that Miami-Dade is very progressive on a lot of other environmental issues that, we would commend around water quality, around sea level rise, around, climate mitigation and adaptation. And then with the waste issue, I think we see where they're sort of kind of sticking to that same decades old policies around burning waste. And I would just add to that, just a background on that is the incinerator in Miami and Doral that recently burned down. That's not the first problematic incinerator in Miami-Dade. There's Old Smoky. That was back in the 50s and 60s. That was in a Bahamian American community. It was a terrible, terrible environmental justice issue. The University of Miami has done a lot of work on that. They've done a documentary on that. They've been part of a class action. And so then there was Old Smoky in the West Grove community in Miami. Then there's the Doral community. And now what we're worried about is they're going to try and build a new incinerator that is just going to continue to move this problem and continue to impact communities. I can say that, this new incinerator, one of the sites they're looking at, that's their preferred site, it would impact Miccosukee tribe tribal lands. They're very concerned about where it is because it's near the Everglades. And it's also near other communities in Broward County that are, have a lot of, Black and Latin populations as well. So I think the worry is that Miami-Dade County is just continuing to put a Band-Aid on the problem and just pick up the problem and move it somewhere else. And what we want to see is, as the largest county in the state of Florida with other progressive environmental policies, to really do that here as well with waste and not be limited by the past and not be limited by industry, but look at other communities. Look at San Francisco. Look at Boulder, Colorado. Look at Baltimore. They're doing some interesting things with composting right now, and actually invest in that and move us away from these, I think, kind of antiquated ways of managing waste that have been proven time and time again to really just be environmental justice problems. They pollute the air, they accelerate climate change, and they're not in certain communities. They're always in other communities. And I think it's just time for something different. And that's what I was getting at with that quote that you shared.
Absolutely. And to follow up on that, there's a famous quote from Andre 3000 when he said the South has something to say in relation to hip hop. So what would you say the South has to say to the rest of the country about environmental justice?
It's a good question. I'm thinking about that. I think the South is where the environmental justice movement was birthed. The South is where we see a lot of these really kind of different types of environmental issues beyond polluting facilities. We see so many different types of issues that communities are facing. And we also see the South is where the civil rights movement began and flourished and grew and really changed, I'd say, the soul of this country and the history of this country and the trajectory of that. And I think with the South leading on these issues, I think across the board, it will be saying that, this is something that matters.
So is this, and I asked that just thinking about the image of the civil rights movement and coalitions, but obviously people of color in the vanguard. And I'm wondering, is this a new civil rights movement within the South, environmental justice?
I would say so. Absolutely. I think in recent years, there's been a push that I'm seeing and that I feel very excited to be a part of to really revitalize what the Civil Rights Act means and what it can address. So, for example, there was a time where you mentioned, using Title VI to try and bring about change. And people might say, oh, well, you'll never hear back from EPA. It might take 20 years. There were lawsuits filed because of all these lengthy delays and even responding to these types of complaints and issues. And now in recent years, what we're seeing is a real push to revitalize and breathe new life into that law and to say, hey, this needs to apply to communities, Black and Brown communities that are being impacted by environmental injustices. And I think practitioners, advocates, organizers, communities, they're not deterred. And it forces us to be creative too. And okay, well, this law and this regulation might be under attack, but how can we go out in the media and continue telling stories about who's impacted where you can't ignore it. It can't be just silence. How can we continue to be vocal? How can we continue to be visible? What are other ways that we can advocate to ensure that this law stays strong? How can we think about changes in strategy around our legal claims that we're bringing? So I would say it's definitely a new civil rights movement. And I think advocates are very committed, very fired up. And I think we're here for that long fight, I would say.
That's incredibly fascinating. And again, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Our next guest is Rue George Warren, a performance artist, researcher, and board member of the Catawba Nation, a native tribe that has existed in South Carolina for more than 5,000 years. Rue's work as a performance artist has brought a greater national exposure and recognition of the contributions that the Catawba and other native tribes have made to the rich history of this land we now call America. Our New South welcomes Rue George Warren. We start out this program by having our guests introduce themselves to our audience. And we also ask at some point a question about being a Southerner. But before we get to that, because I'm thinking of it differently, let me just have you introduce yourself, where you're from, where you're at, and what it is you do.
Tanakani Temp, Niat Alexander George Warren, Niat Ni Tempru, Ye Ismare, Ye Katabare, Ye Migra Re. Hi, everyone. My name is Delesslin George Warren, but everyone's called me Rue, like kangaroo, since I was born. So please feel free to call me that. I'm a citizen of Catawba Nation. My background is art, community development, cultural work. But as of August of this year, I'm also now one of the elected leaders for Catawba Nation. So I've been transitioning into the world of politics, which is just as much fun as you might imagine.
As I said, we've asked people about being in the South, and we've talked to people who are immigrants to the South. We've talked to people who grew up in the South. We talked to people who have returned to the South. Mm-hmm. But I feel uncomfortable asking an indigenous person about that because you've always been there. And so now, through these other ideas and through the colonization of this land, it would just be incorrect to ask you, I think, about what it's like being in the South, because the South to you is indigenous homeland that other people have arrived to. And this is the beginning of the Trail of Tears, where the United States government forced Native people off their ancestral lands, And now this area that we call the South, which you have survived in, has the smallest share of indigenous people in the United States. And so, given that background, how do you think of what other people think of this as the South, which is your ancestral homeland?
Well, I want to start with the land. I mean, one thing that we talk a lot about in Catawba Nation is how grateful and how honored we are to still be able to walk along the lands that our ancestors have for millennia, right? It's not true for a lot of tribes that are originally from these areas, like you just said, who were forced to remove either through the Trail of Tears or through any number of forced walks out west. At the same time, I have the perspective of my mom's side of the family is Catawba. My grandfather was our assistant chief for about 30 years. My mom was our tribal administrator for about a decade. My aunt has run the cultural center for our tribe since before I was born. So I have that perspective, but I also have the perspective from my dad's side of the family, where it's historically a bunch of plantation owners as well as Indian agents. And so even within myself, there is this conflicted history of this rising power, this rising white dominated power in the Southeast, both through the plantation system, slavery and economic exploitation, but also through the expropriation of indigenous lands and how those things have to work together, right? It's the necessity of removing indigenous people to make room on the land for this forced labor to create this economic system. And so for me, I'm seeing all of those things. I'm also married to an immigrant. My husband is from Colombia. And so I'm also navigating this immigration system, which also has really interesting intersections with living on reservation land, because it's a different sort of context than just living inside of a city or municipality in the state of South Carolina, for example. So I have lots of conflicted feelings about the Southeast, but I love it. It's my home, and I have a lot of hope for it as well.
Wow, that's a lot of context. It is just amazing. And, one of the things that I think about in this series when we talk about the South is that people do not think of Native Americans, indigenous people in the South. And so how should we think about that population that is left?
Yeah, I think that the biggest issue that we face as tribes in the Southeast, but also more generally in the East Coast, is an issue of erasure. So this is as simple as, like, when I go into town and I am talking to someone at a bar or a restaurant and they say, "Where do you live?" And I say, "I live on the reservation." And they say, "What reservation?" And I say, "The one right past the mall. Like, are you new to the area?" And they say, "No, I've grown up here." And so there's just a complete unawareness of the fact that there is a federally recognized tribe just down the street from where folks in my hometown are growing up. And that has some pretty profound impacts for a lot of other reasons. One of those reasons is around data. So one of the issues that we face as a nation is that we don't have great data about things like incarceration, educational achievement, interactions with the child protective services, because people are not trained to actually ask the question. They assume that they will be able to just interpret someone as being Native American or not being Native American based on what they look like. And for people who can't see me, I'm very pale skinned. I'm white. I have blue eyes. I'm still a citizen of Catawba Nation. And the reason why that matters is because, in addition to us being able to have good data about how our people are being interacted with by the state and other municipalities, it's also that our citizens have certain rights in the United States based on their status as citizens of tribal nations, most famously around the Indian Child Welfare Act, which gives a place for tribes to be a part of child protective service cases, so that we can ensure that if a child does need to be removed from their home, that they still have the chance to grow up inside of their tribal community, to learn their culture, to learn their language, to learn what it means to be a Catawba person. And so that's one of the biggest issues that we face. Another issue is around political power. So when you look at tribes in the Dakotas, Arizona, I mean, just even in the 2020 election, the impact that Native vote had in Arizona, places like Arizona, is often not talked about, but it had a huge impact. And we are so small in number. Our tribe is a little bit under 4,000 people, but we're kind of spread out. So about 1,000 of us live on the reservation or right off. Another 1,000 live in our traditional homeland. So that's the Piedmont of the Carolinas. And the rest live all over the place in the United States and around the world. And so we don't have this large cohort of voters in which we can use that to go to politicians and say, you need to really work with us on these sorts of things. So that's some of the issues that we face based on our numbers, and just the lack of awareness that we exist.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Rue. And my name is Robert Green II. I'm coming to you actually from Columbia, South Carolina. So I'm just down the road. And I have to say, we and our producers have been joking. There have been some episodes that could go 3 hours or so. And this is one of those, because when you mentioned the term erasure, I said, okay, this is a really important point. And there's a lot we want to cover in terms of environmental justice, food security, and the like. But I do want to ask you a bit about that question of erasure. Now, I teach at Cliff University, an HBCU here in South Carolina, and I often take great pains to talk about indigenous history in the Palmetto State, or what will become known as South Carolina. And I am often floored every semester by how little our students know about the Catawba tribe, the Yamasee tribe, the Cherokee, the Creek, and so forth. Could you talk a bit to our audience about the importance of the Catawba tribe to the history of South Carolina? Because I think when we think of South Carolina, historically speaking, it's often done in the prism, pardon the pun, of black and white. But as Kevin so astutely pointed out, indigenous peoples have been here long before there was such a thing as a South Carolina. So could you talk a bit to our audience about the Catawba tribe's place in that history and why they're so important to the history of the Palmetto State?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot we could talk about in the deeper history, but I think if we just skip straight on forward to the 1700s, that's a good place to start. Right. In the 1700s, Catawbas are really trying to present ourselves as important military allies for anyone who is trying to have some sort of military action, particularly as it pertains to what at the time was the frontier, which was not far away from Columbia, South Carolina, right? It's just up the road, a little bit east of the Appalachian Mountains. And so in the French and Indian Wars, for example, we were sided with the British. That's how we first got to know George Washington, who wrote about us, specifically worked beside us, shoulder to shoulder. After the French and Indian Wars, there is this treaty, the Treaty of Augusta, in which the very shape of South Carolina actually gets decided. And so if you ever look at the border between South Carolina and North Carolina, right around Charlotte, North Carolina, there's a big pizza wedge that's kind of taken out of North Carolina. And that's because that was our treaty lands in the Treaty of Augusta, 1763. North Carolina colony did not want Catawba Nation in North Carolina. And so the border literally goes around that treaty land.
And yet, it's as if Native people are invisible in this region that we're doing this podcast about. So how do you begin to change that story and to shed light on Native people, particularly in the South, without having it done by others who would want to appropriate your culture?
How do we do that? That's a great question. I'll say first how I've done it personally. So in 2016, leading up to the presidential election, my background is in performance, specifically operatic performance, but I've also done performance art. And so that kind of culminated into what I called unsettling tours of the Presidential Portrait Gallery in DC. Because like most of the South, the Presidential Portrait Gallery completely erases indigenous people from these presidents, despite the fact that that was, for most of the presidents, their primary concern was how to deal with the Indian problem, right, as they would often call it. And so I would give these tours and kind of bring that story into the place. Since then, I've done it at a few other locations, including at the Columbia Museum of Art with their recent Catawba pottery exhibition. But one area that I have a lot of hope around is actually the work that I did with our cultural center for the last several years, which is around public education. There was a study, I believe, from the University of Pittsburgh or maybe the University of Pennsylvania that found that 90% of state mandated textbooks don't mention Native people after 1900. So what lesson are kids getting about Native people that we simply don't exist? As you heard before, there's a lot of history that's happened over the last 100 years with tribes.
Could you tell us a bit about how the Catawba Nation is dealing with issues of environmental degradation? And again, I think our listeners may not be as familiar with what the Catawba tribe is facing in particular, but could you talk a bit about how some of these problems are arising for the Catawba Nation and what they're trying to do to counteract these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one thing that Indigenous communities bring to these fights for environmental justice is the long memory. And so we have in our memory a time where the landscape that we see throughout the Southeast was vastly different. The lands that the first Europeans saw when they came here were not these thick, difficult to navigate forests everywhere. It was actually what was called a Piedmont savanna throughout the Southeast. And that's because tribes practice these controlled burns. And so instead of the thick forest, kind of the Walden Pond-esque description of nature, imagine instead this giant open fields with these very large trees spread out through them. It was notable because it was such a productive ecosystem. And what that I think is really interesting and something that is often put aside in environmental conversations is the belief that humanity must be degradatory towards the environment and the earth. There's sometimes this narrative of humanity as a virus or a disease, and that is not true. We are of the earth, and not only are we capable of just not doing harm, we can actually do good. We can actually be a part of making a more productive, a more beautiful, more delicious ecosystem. In Catawba Nation, the issues that we face are mostly around land access. So, for example, our food is connected to our culture, is connected to our land, is connected to our food, is connected to our culture. It is all connected together in there. One example is around our traditional corn. And so we grew this for millennia. It's amazing corn, but we stopped growing it as the 60s, 70s, and 80s are coming about, and Catawbas are really able to participate in the economic system of the surrounding area for the first time, leaving less room for folks to work in large-scale farms or bigger gardens, and instead focusing on making money to provide food for the family. And so when we got together in 2017, 2018, to just have a conversation about food sovereignty, I mean, we were working on it in these silos in our tribe, but we weren't sitting down together to have the conversation. When we finally sat down together, everyone said it. Elders, our culture director, all these folks said, we need to bring the corn back. And so we started talking to farmers. No one had it. We eventually found it in the seed library, actually in North Carolina, the extension office in North Carolina, and they sent it back down to us. And we've been growing it ever since then. But from there has been just these amazing revelations around, for example, nixtamalization, the processing of corn, the nutritional value of corn, but also cultural practices around using the fibers to weave, our green corn dance, bringing back these cultural practices of planting and harvesting, all kind of integrated into each other. We also face issues of pollution. For example, the Catawba River was named in the early 2010s as one of the most endangered river systems in the United States. Part of that is dams. Part of that is the history of the heavy textile mills in the region. And so even to this day, the recommendation is not to eat more than a few fish out of the river each month. When I did my introduction at the beginning, I said "Yen Isware" because in our language we call ourselves the people of the river. We are fish people. We have eaten fish for a long, long time, and we still have families that rely on the river as one of their major protein sources. And so, figuring out how to still provide that, not just the fish, but also the practice of catching the fish and preparing the fish is a challenge that we're trying to figure out at the same time.
And with some of this work on environmental justice, have you been successful in finding allies in the region to help you in this endeavor?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a bunch of, for example, land trusts in the region that we've worked with. I will say it's still an issue of sometimes getting on the same page about that thing that I talked about before, that the way that we protect the earth is not by separating humans from it, but by integrating us into it. There's a really strong idea, and this comes from the creation of the national parks, that preserving the earth means separating humans from it. It's really synonymous with conservation. And our idea, our belief, our value is that the way that you preserve this beauty is by having humans interact with it in a good way. One example of that is around river cane. River cane used to be everywhere in the Southeast. It was breaks of cane for miles and miles and miles. It was one of the first kind of ecotypes that was cut down when new farms were being created because the soil was so rich from the process of the river cane system. And along with river cane came a bunch of cultural practices and traditions for us. I mean, the river cane were really integral to a number of species, including the Carolina parakeet. And I just remember the first time I heard about this, I cried because I didn't realize that we had a parakeet in the Southeast. And it was a communal parakeet. So it lived in these colonies. And the reason why it no longer exists is because when people started planting their crops in long, straight rows in monocrops, the parakeets would come in and just strip all of the grain, for example, from it. And so then people would hunt them. But the thing about the parakeets is when one was shot and fell to the ground, the others would all go to the ground to see what had happened to it or to mourn it, right? And so then all of them would be shot at the same time. And so I was talking with our linguist one day about this, and I was like, did you know this story about the parakeet? And she was like, that must be why in Catawba, one of the ways of saying someone's a bad person is saying that they're a bird killer. Is this relationship between the destruction of the birds, the millinery trade as well, of course, but also the destruction of the parakeets and the ecosystem that they relied on.
And given how horrific we know the idea of the South became for Native people, this idea of the New South, whatever that is to you, and the future of Native people within it, what's your viewpoint on that? What might that look like?
I mean, I hope that we can take all of the beautiful things about Southern culture, like the hospitality, like, oh my gosh, just the kindness that people have for strangers in the Southeast is just so unparalleled. Not just in the United States, but even traveling internationally. It's kind of astounding to me how nice people find me just because I feel like I'm just being like average for a Southerner, right? But that sort of ethic, the ethic of care for family, or even not family, but neighbors, someone in your community who's going through, like when I lost my mom and I lost my sister, just so much food brought to my house, just these acts of care, this sense of a community, which is sometimes really lacking in other places. I mean, I think there's so many beautiful things that have been born of the history that we have as Southerners that I would love for us to really turn into values and ethics for moving forward. And I'm hoping that a lot of that organizing can happen around economic consciousness, because it's as true in the South as it is anywhere else. Money rules, and the money here is very, very, very old. And so I'm hoping that we can have some consciousness around that and start saying, hey, it's not working for any of us. Let's figure it out and get these damn roads fixed.
No, thank you so much for that. And again, as a reminder, I'm glad you finished up with the economic consciousness angle, because it's worth noting that Martin Luther King Jr.'s last campaign, his Poor People's Campaign, included an outreach effort to indigenous peoples, because he understood by the end of his life that everyone, indigenous, poor whites, folks from Appalachia, African Americans, etc., Mexican Americans, they were all brought together under this problem of poverty and economic despair. So again, as is the case with so much in Southern history, Southern life, it all comes full circle. So just want to thank you again for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Hello. Thank you.
In our closing reflections of today's podcast, we have a quote from New York Times best-selling author and scholar Tressie McMillan Cottom as she speaks about the power of the growing environmental justice movement in the South today.
Look at something like Jackson, Mississippi, where I think they are having some of the most exciting, meaningful conversation about things like climate change in Jackson, Mississippi, and who should be at the table of that conversation. And they're saying, well, you can't really talk about climate change unless you talk about why some people have clean drinking water and other people don't. And that's not an out there conversation. That's a conversation happening right now that is about how we have done residential segregation in the South, which has been pushed forward by, again, the historical, right, legacies of race and class.
Man, Robert, I would just like to thank the Levine Museum of the New South and the producers of this podcast for inviting me on, a journalist from the sports pages, to talk about this concept of the New South. And I love history. And I actually do love and am fascinated by Southern history. And I think I knew a lot, but I learned so much more. And it really made me think differently about the region of this country in which you were born and reared.
As a historian who studies the South, this show has been a phenomenal moment in my life and career. And first, I want to thank you, Kevin, for being such a great co-host. I want to thank the Levine Museum of the New South for also inviting me on board. And I have to say, in every single episode and every single interview, I learned something new about the South. It's not enough to know about the South's history or traditions or culture. It's much more to know about what the South means to Southerners today. And we talk to so many different folks who come from a whole bunch of different backgrounds, including many we don't think of as Southern, but they're just as Southern as a bowl of grits or an SEC football game. And so this was a tremendous opportunity that I was just simply glad to be part of.
And I guess being born in Washington, D.C., to a mother who was born in Virginia, and to grandparents on my father's side who were born deep in Maryland, I can appreciate being a son of the South.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this the South got something to say.
Our New South is brought to you by the Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, North Carolina, thanks to the generous support of the Knight Foundation. Our New South is produced by Next Chapter Podcast. It's written and produced by Byron Hunter. The editor and sound designer is Kyle Murdock. Executive producers are Jeremiah Tittle and Franky Abbott. Our technical producer is Brian Douglas.
With special thanks to Levine team members Alexander Piñeres, Karen Sutton, and Cliff Whitfield.
Please follow the show, subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast. Learn more at ncpodcast.com/Our New South and museumofthenewsouth.org.
The South got something to say.
From the history of radioactive makeup to all the loony things Henry VIII did to ensure we never stop making movies about him, Weird History is a podcast that answers all the questions you didn't even know you had about the most unbelievable people, places, and events of the past. Based on the hugely successful YouTube channel, Weird History invites you to bone up on what it was like to use a public bathroom in ancient Rome while learning about the single worst year of all time. Don't worry, we missed it by a millennium or so. Then get the skinny on modern history, like the true story behind The Conjuring, and just what the hell Steven Seagal did to get banned from SNL. Let Weird History be your guide to the stranger side of history they don't teach you in school. Because the past is weird, a lot weirder than you think. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Next Chapter Podcasts.